Hi, Year 12. This is going to be your introduction to your Year 13 studies that we are going to start in the final half term of Year 12, alongside the coursework that you are undertaking. The topic of your studies is going to be Britain losing and gaining an empire from 1763 to 1914, and I'm going to take you on a tour of an awful lot of the large parts of this map that are coloured in red, as we study how Britain almost lost and then regained what would become the biggest empire the world has ever seen. The course is supported by this textbook. I will provide you with a hyperlink to be able to purchase that from Amazon, but also be aware I have a series of copies, second-hand copies in school, which I will access on and lend out on a first-come, first-served basis. You'll just have to email me and let me know that. The lessons and the entire course, the worksheets, the PowerPoints, the video versions of the lessons are all supported on Google Classroom, and I will issue you with the access code for that particular course. Okay, as with all your courses, we start with the big picture first and then we drill down into the detail. We're going to deal with the course in two overview topics, and then we're going to look at a whole set of detailed topics, but they will all be set against the background of this. This is breaking the course down into simple, manageable chunks of three, the thirds as I will keep referring to it. You'll see that they're all set against a timeline, and as you look you will see that there is a connection between the way in which we break down these thirds. They seemingly hinge on key dates in British history around the end of the 18th century and around 1875. I'm going to take you through each of these in turn now, and it's very, very important that when we start teaching face-to-face, you understand these particular terms. So you may well want to make a copy of this particular part of the course and stick it up on the wall. This is the important stuff to understand. Firstly, we'll deal with the first line here. The First British Empire refers to Britain's Atlantic Empire based upon the Caribbean, the 13 colonies, what will become the United States, and also Canada. But that is lost to the British around 1775 down here. This could have been the end of the British Empire, but it isn't. It's the first phase. The Second British Empire will last much, much longer, all the way through to the end of the course. However, here around 1875, I refer to a transition, the British Empire being challenged. Now this will become clearer as we move through the course and I move through these other examples. You'll see how it was being challenged. Secondly, this is the economic strand. The British Empire was based upon the mercantile economic system until around the end of the 18th century, when Britain gradually transitioned through to something called free trade. Now, we need to understand these terms and we will study them in depth later. However, around 1875, the British transitioned from free trade in its purest form to free trade with protectionism, linked to the idea of Britain starting to be being challenged. The third one, Britain ran a formal mercantile empire. Now we already know mercantile is an economic system that we have to study, but when I refer to the term formal empire, I am referring to countries actually taking over parts of the world, running up their flag, and making it part of their own. That was what the British had a taste for up until around the end of the 18th century. We took over 13 colonies in America, we took over parts of Canada, we took over islands in the Caribbean. From around the start of the 19th century, however, Britain doesn't pursue that. We become a very powerful nation which doesn't take over parts of the world. Rather like the United States or China today, very powerful countries, but they don't own other parts of the world. However, from 1875, again this key date of 1875, Britain moves from informal to formal acquisitions. Britain actually does start painting the world red and running up the Union Jack all over the world, forming the world's biggest empire. The fourth set of thirds, we have an Atlantic empire based upon North America and the Caribbean. It's the first British Empire. Britain looked westwards. However, Britain will transition from a westward Atlantic empire into a global Eastern orientated empire focused upon India, which will become referred to as the jewel in the crown. And this will be Britain's perspective all the way through to 1914, a global empire. Now, our fifth set of thirds is a real key set of terminology that you need to be clear and understanding of. From 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, through to around 1805 to 1815, 1805 being the naval battle at Trafalgar, the single greatest naval victory ever, and Waterloo in 1815, where Napoleon was defeated on land, Britain is the single most powerful country in the world. It is superior. That means Britain could have taken on any other country in the world at that time and beaten them. However, from 1805-1815 through until 1875, Britain transcends superiority, and Britain becomes supreme. Now, by supreme, I mean Britain could have taken on every other country in the world and beaten them. This is the case through until, again, this arbitrary date of 1875. Britain becomes challenged. Our supremacy is challenged by other countries. The countries beaten around 1805, 1815 take 60 years to bounce back. They then start to challenge the British position. Britain remains supreme, but supremacy is being challenged. Our final line. Britain down here until the end of the 19th century, the 18th century, I beg your pardon, is an isolationist country. The mercantile system makes Britain an isolated, insular economic system and country. However, from the end of the 18th century, Britain dominates the world, running it, policing it with her Royal Navy, and operates in splendid isolation. However, in 1875, with her supremacy being challenged, Britain starts to seek out friends in the world. And this will result in a series of deals and agreements made with various different countries. This is the big picture that you have to be familiar with. It's the one that needs to be printed off, put on your wall, and understood. Okay, so what we're going to do is the following. We are going to study two breadth studies, one to do with economics and trade, the second one to do with the Royal Navy. We're going to start with trade and then move on to the Royal Navy. The rationale behind this is it's trade and economics that provide the money, and it's the money that funds the Royal Navy, which protects the trade. So a virtuous circle. We will start off with trade and the Royal Navy after you've studied a few overview lessons. When we have done that, you will then study these 5 case studies. As you do these 5 case studies, as with the 2 breadth studies, you will see how these link back to the thirds that we've already looked at. And as we progress through the course, you will start to see the connections between each of these set against the context of the breadth studies, set against the overview of the picture that we are looking at. A complex interweaving and interleaved story that you are going to need to grasp. And you'll see how they all overlap when you look at the dates. So, our first detailed study, our depth study, will be the loss of the American colonies. How did Britain acquire and then lose the 13 colonies that went on to form the United States? As Britain is losing the United States, how did Britain establish, and for what purpose did Britain establish, what will become Australia? How did the events of the loss of the 13 colonies affect Britain's handling of a similar set of occurrences that started to take place in Canada between 1837 and 1840? And how did Britain mature as an imperial power? At the same time, how did Britain rule India differently, being a non-white settler colony, And how did the events of the Mutiny of 1857 affect Britain's imperial outlook? And finally, as Britain is challenged by rivals in the world, how did Britain behave differently in the Nile Valley between 1882 and 1898? So we will take you on a global tour of what was the British Empire. Now on the next slides, you've got the specialist areas in more detail that you can read in your own time. The exam will be 30% of your final mark, a written exam lasting 2 hours and 15 minutes, of which you will answer 3 questions, one from section A, one from B, and one from C. An example of the paper that you will look at.